The late afternoon sun spilled gold over the quiet streets of Maroubra, painting the weathered brick houses and surf-worn fences in a warm glow. A faint scent of salt hung in the air from the nearby beach, mingling with the aroma of sizzling sausages from backyard barbies. Sophie Parker leaned against the chipped wooden counter of the local cafe, her apron dusted with flour, and sighed. Another day, another dollar, she thought. The espresso machine hissed behind her, filling the air with steam, yet it wasn't enough to warm the emptiness she felt. Her life had become a series of routines she went through almost automatically: pour the coffee, wipe down the tables, nod politely to the regulars. The dreams she had when she first moved to Sydney from a small town in Victoria seemed a lifetime away. Traveling, studying, maybe even opening her own little art studio, none of that seemed possible anymore. Reality had a way of sneaking in and shoving dreams aside. "Oi, Sophie. You alive over there?" called Matt, the cafe's cheeky barista, waving a towel at her. She forced a small smile, tucking a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Alive, barely," she muttered, sliding the last croissant onto the display tray. The bell above the cafe door jingled, and in walked someone who made her heart skip in ways Sophie hadn't felt in months. Luke Thompson, tall, sun-kissed, a grin permanently etched on his face as though the world was perpetually in his favor. He had that effortless charm that made everyone warm to him, but especially her. Their eyes met, and she felt that familiar flutter in her chest, despite her better judgment. "Hey, stranger," Luke said, his voice casual, though there was an undeniable pull behind it. "Hey," Sophie replied, brushing her hands on her apron. "Coffee?" "Yeah, and maybe a chat too, if you've got a minute." He leaned against the counter, a mischievous sparkle in his eyes. Sophie felt a smile creep onto her face. They had met a few months back at a local beach cleanup event. Sophie had been stooping to pick up a stray bottle when he had crouched beside her, offering a hand with a grin and a quip that made her laugh like no one else had in years. Since then, their paths had crossed more often than by chance. They talked easily, slipping into that comfortable rhythm where words felt unnecessary, and yet every conversation left Sophie buzzing. Luke had big ideas, like opening a surf shop or traveling across Australia to volunteer at remote communities. He spoke of adventures with the kind of light-hearted passion that made Sophie's own dreams feel alive again, yet, beneath the warmth, there was a slight edge she couldn't ignore. Luke had a tendency to drift, to chase the next thrill without thinking about tomorrow. Sophie knew this, but her heart chose to overlook it. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. Sophie found herself daydreaming about weekends at the coast, long drives along the Great Ocean Road, and evenings spent under string lights in his tiny apartment. Luke made promises, small ones at first, like teaching her to surf, introducing her to his mates, taking her to hidden spots only locals knew. Each promise, though casual, built a fragile scaffolding of hope in Sophie's chest, but reality wasn't that kind. Bills piled up faster than she could keep track of. Her mum's health was beginning to decline, and Sophie found herself stretched thin, juggling work, family, and a budding romance that she wasn't sure could survive the pressures of life outside a postcard-perfect day at the beach point one evening. As they sat on the dunes watching the sun sink below the horizon, Sophie tried to voice her worries. "Luke? I don't know if I can do this," she said softly, her fingers tracing patterns in the sand. Luke looked at her, his brows knitting in confusion. "Do what?" "Balance it all. Life, work, us. It feels like I'm running just to stand still." Her voice trembled, betraying the uncertainty she felt. Luke leaned back, eyes scanning the waves. "Sophie, you worry too much. We'll figure it out. We always do, right?" His confidence was reassuring, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't fully understand. She wanted stability, a shared plan for the future, but Luke lived in the moment, like the ocean, beautiful, thrilling, but impossible to hold on to. The first rail crack came subtly. Luke started coming home late from work, distracted, avoiding her questions about the future. Weekend trips were postponed for mates' errands or impromptu adventures. leaving Sophie feeling sidelined. At first, she brushed it off, telling herself he just needed space, that it wasn't a reflection on her. Then came the fight. It was over something minor, Luke forgetting to pick up her prescription, but it spiraled into an argument that left both of them raw. "You don't think about anyone but yourself," Sophie yelled, frustration spilling out after weeks of pent-up tension. Luke's jaw tightened, his usual easy grin replaced by a shadowed frown. "And you think I don't care?" "Sophie, I'm doing my best, all right." "You call this best?" she shot back, voice breaking. "You're here, but you're not really here. We're meant to be building something, Luke, but it feels like I'm standing on my own." He said nothing after that, storming off toward his car. Sophie watched the taillights fade, the wind carrying away the last warmth of the evening. She sank onto the sand, tears blending with the cool grains, the horizon darkening around her. For the first time, she truly saw the fragile nature of the dreams she had stitched together with him. They weren't destroyed yet, but they were splintered, hanging by threads she wasn't sure could hold. Sophie realized that love alone wouldn't patch over the cracks life had already carved. She needed more than charm and promise, she needed partnership, commitment, someone who could meet her halfway. By the time she trudged home, the stars had started to prick the inky sky. Her apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, the absence of Luke weighing heavy. She poured a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her hands, and thought about what she wanted, what she truly needed. As she stared out the window at the distant city lights, Sophie made a quiet promise to herself. She would not let her dreams be dictated by someone else's whims. She would find a way to pursue them, even if it meant walking the path alone for a while. The night settled over Maroubra, the waves whispering secrets to the sand, and Sophie finally let herself sleep. A mix of sorrow and determination battling in her chest. Tomorrow would be another day, and maybe, just maybe, she would find the courage to reclaim her own story. The morning after the fight with Luke, Sophie woke to a pale, grey light filtering through her curtains. The apartment felt emptier than usual, the silence echoing in corners that had once held laughter and late-night chatter. She sat on the edge of her bed, tea cooling in her hands, and felt a familiar ache settle in her chest. Yet, amidst the heartbreak, a flicker of determination sparked. Sophie knew she couldn't stay tangled in what ifs and regrets forever. Work at the cafe was a welcome distraction. The hiss of the espresso machine, the smell of roasted beans, and the chatter of regulars pulled her out of her head for a little while. Her boss, Mrs. Hargreaves, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a fondness for sarcastic quips, noticed the slump in Sophie's shoulders. "You all right, love?" she asked, wiping down the counter. Sophie forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Mrs. Hargreaves gave her a knowing look, as though she'd seen this kind of heartbreak before. "Tired or heartbroken? 'Cause I can make you a strong flat white, with a shot of resilience if it's the latter." Sophie chuckled, the corners of her mouth lifting despite herself. "I think I'll take the flat white, thanks." It was little moments like these, small doses of humor and kindness, that began to anchor her. Outside of work, Sophie started walking along the beach again, alone this time, letting the wind whip her hair and the waves remind her that the world was bigger than her pain. She carried a notebook, sketching the dunes, the seagulls, even the occasional surfer catching a wave. Art had always been her refuge, and now it became a lifeline. Her friends rallied too. Jess and Tara, mates from university, dragged her out for dinners, pub quizzes, and even a weekend hike in the Blue Mountains. At first, Sophie resisted. She didn't feel up for socializing, but the laughter, the shared stories, and the gentle teasing reminded her she wasn't as alone as she thought. One evening, after a particularly long walk along the boardwalk, Sophie stopped at a lookout over the ocean. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, and she felt a strange sense of clarity. She realized that the heartbreak, as painful as it was, had also taught her something vital. She had the strength to survive on her own. She didn't need Luke, or anyone else, to define her happiness. With renewed focus, Sophie started making changes. She enrolled in a weekend art course at a local community center, something she had always put off, thinking she didn't have the time or money. On the first day, she felt the familiar flutter of nerves, standing amidst other artists with sketchpads and paintbrushes. But as she lifted the brush, colors spilling across the canvas, she felt a rush of freedom, a reclaiming of a part of herself that had been quiet for too long. Work remained steady, but Sophie also started taking small steps toward her bigger dreams. She researched grants, looked into part-time tutoring for kids in art, and even considered a short trip up the coast to a quiet town she'd always wanted to paint. Each plan, each tiny step, was a victory over the weight of the past, yet, healing wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others. She would catch herself expecting a message from Luke, or glance at the spots they used to sit together, only to be met with an ache that made her chest tighten. On those days, she leaned into her friends, or into her art, letting her emotions flow onto paper, instead of into her heart. A turning point came unexpectedly. Sophie was at a local art exhibition, nervously showing some of her sketches, when she struck up a conversation with a man named Daniel. He wasn't like Luke, steady, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in her perspective. They talked about art, travel, and the small joys of living in the city. Sophie didn't feel the old rush of infatuation, but instead a calm curiosity, a sense that maybe new beginnings didn't have to be chaotic or painful. This encounter didn't erase the past, nor did it rush her into anything. Instead, it reinforced a truth Sophie was slowly learning: she didn't need someone else to validate her worth. She could take her time, explore new connections, and embrace her independence fully. Over the following months, Sophie's life began to shift. She spent mornings walking the beach, afternoons painting, evenings at the cafe chatting with regulars and friends. The apartment that had felt empty now seemed full of possibility. She even started planning a small solo trip along the coast, bringing her sketchpad and camera, eager to capture the beauty of places she had once only dreamed of visiting. One Saturday morning, Sophie found herself back on the dunes where she and Luke had fought. She stood at the top, letting the wind buffet her face, eyes scanning the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, waves rolling in like the steady heartbeat of the world. She felt the familiar sting of memory, but it no longer weighed her down. Instead, it reminded her that even broken dreams could teach resilience, and even heartache could give way to hope. Sophie thought about the journey ahead, full of uncertainties, challenges, and small triumphs. She knew that some days would be harder than others, that loneliness would occasionally creep back in. But she also knew that she had the tools to navigate life on her own terms: creativity, self-respect, supportive friends, and the courage to keep dreaming. By sunset, she packed her sketchpad and notebook, heading down to the water's edge. The waves lapped at her feet, cold but invigorating, and she let herself laugh aloud, a sound that felt entirely her own. It was a small moment, but in it was freedom, a reclamation of self. As she walked back along the beach, city lights twinkling in the distance, Sophie realized that heartbreak had not been the end of her story. It had been a turning point, a catalyst for growth. And while the dreams she had once shared with Luke lay scattered like shells along the shore, she could gather new ones, piece by piece, building a life that was entirely, undeniably hers. By the time she reached her apartment, the sky had darkened to a deep indigo, stars beginning to prick the night. Sophie sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world outside. She smiled softly to herself, a quiet affirmation of her journey. She was no longer just surviving, she was beginning to thrive. Heartbreak had shattered her illusions, yes, but it had also opened a door. And Sophie, for the first time in a long while, felt ready to walk through it.